Have you ever noticed that in the history of mankind there are gaps that cannot be filled, sharp jumps in development, and long years and even millennia during which nothing happened? Yes, nothing happened. In fact, there was a bit left, sword by sword, and the bow with arrows was just a bow with arrows. Literally, the creative spark left the human mind, and we existed as in a dream. In any case, such conclusions follow from the study of official history. No, of course, something did happen after all. One ruled, a czar, a king, a pharaoh, then his son, daughter, successor, murderer, and so on. One went to war with another. The war lasted so many years, well, and essentially that's all. But the average reign of one czar can reach from 5 to 60 years. These are whole generations. Anything can happen during this time. But what we know about these times is covered with a huge amount of speculation and fantasy. Of course, not everyone is satisfied with this state of affairs. It really strongly smells of some kind of scam from all this. And it is on these and intuitive feelings of unsaid, an alternative view of history is born. We are not satisfied with banal answers, because if you look more closely at the sources on which the ancient history of mankind is based on small details and nuances, then this history begins to falter and collapse right before our eyes. You are on the Epoch of Distrust channel, and today we will try again to look at some events in history based not so much on records as on the logic of what is happening. In the end, if you don't like what you hear and see here, just take it as science fiction, since I naturally have no evidence that events unfolded exactly like this. Everything that will be said further is nothing more than one of the scenarios of events development that I assume. I have already shown in my films, like in the trilogy about Alexander the Great, that the history we are taught in schools and universities is quite heavily edited, and the understanding of events is directed in a completely different direction. Remember, in the films about the Macedonian, we simply read the primary sources, that is, Plutarch, Arrian, and some others. But only them, not the edited versions in Cambridge and dogmas taken for granted and propagated through the narrative. And in the end, we got a completely different picture of the world and what is happening. Or look, for example, we all know that Giordano Bruno was burned at the stake for believing that the earth is round and revolves around the sun. But no, in fact he was burned for something completely different. According to the reports of his disgruntled student, Giovanni Mocenigo, whom Giordano simply refused to teach due to his poor memory, and who told the Inquisition from hiding, that Giordano Bruno considered Christ a mere magician, that Christ did not actually want to be crucified, and so on. Seems like a trifle, doesn't it? What's the point of subtly changing information about historical figures right under our noses? Well, who cares whether they burned Giordano for not believing in the dogmas about Christ, or for thinking that the earth is round? In the end, the fact remains a fact. He was burned for heresy. Either way, the outcome doesn't change. He was in any case, seemingly, especially since they replaced this information specifically. In the enlightened time, when the world is already full of atheists, in the unbelievers, there even exists a whole huge state, the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, where they did not believe at the official level. However, someone really wanted as many people as possible not to know the truth about why Giordano Bruno was really executed. Well, he considered Christ a magician, and in general he himself taught magic. And so, what is so scary about this information for the lay people? It's unclear. Why has someone been directing science away from understanding the ether for hundreds of years? It's still unclear what actually forced Napoleon to go to Russia in general and to Moscow in particular. Why are they hiding the whole planet's hibernation? With sand and clay? But time does not stand still. If before such frauds were easily carried out within certain specific and limited regions and libraries, Then with the advent of computers, databases, a single information space of the internet, everything begins to crack at the seams. There are inconsistencies here and there. Very slowly, but inexorably, the public database grows, and along with it, bit by bit, a grandiose picture of hidden events is being drawn. Facts are accumulating, sometimes even at the cost of the lives of enthusiast seekers. And over the last couple of decades, there has been a breakthrough. We now know for sure that there was a grandiose catastrophe, the consequences of which are now impossible to hide. Denying the existence of buildings buried all over the world is simply foolish. Yes, we can see sandstorms right now where they shouldn't be. Europe, Yakutia, Ukraine. But they keep telling us straight that the sand came from the Sahara or China. If only they were the ones. Technological progress and the internet have allowed us to connect scattered pieces of knowledge into a more or less coherent picture. Megaliths, plastic technology of stone softening, evidence of gods also played with new colors. Myths and legends suddenly lost their brightness and beauty of fantasy and fairy tales and began to acquire the harsh, dull color of reality. Extraterrestrials suddenly became very close neighbors, whose bases with a high degree of probability are located directly in our solar system and whose coordinates are already known. Evidence of catastrophic cosmic scale disasters in the solar system is also gaining more and more proof. Well then, in that case, let's continue the story started a bit earlier in the movie Alien Bases. In it, we assumed what actions intelligent civilizations would have to take if they were in the solar system at that moment. If intelligent civilizations were on every planet in our system, if there were far more planets themselves, what would these civilizations have to face in the face of a rapidly advancing cosmic scale catastrophe? One of the mandatory points would have been the creation of space bases on certain orbits, impossible under natural conditions. These orbits should have maximally brought the bases themselves beyond the limits of the flatness of the all-destructive stream of asteroids, removed them from its path. And wonder of wonders, we actually found 5 such objects. Not only that, each of them is on such ideal orbits that first of all they absolutely do not intersect either with each other or with any of the planets. That is, they have no chance of colliding with anything. Secondly, it creates the impression that they are tied to certain planets like markers. One base is located in orbit exactly between Earth and Venus, the second between Mars and Jupiter, others beyond Neptune in the Kuiper belt. In other words, they exist. But this was the 4th step in our action list. And now let's go a little further and try to delve deeper into the 3rd stage. In it, we assumed that since the asteroid flow will almost certainly damage all the planets, everything that is in the plane of the ecliptic, then we need to care about the preservation of the species as a whole, not about any individual personalities. This means we need to leave deep underground bases on every planet in the solar system, including all existing civilizations at that moment. At this point, we need to put aside both internal and external disputes, claims, if there were any, since it's about the survival of everyone. Each planet was supposed to be divided into sectors, enclaves, in which deep underground city bunkers were dug. Of course, in these cities, hardly any active life was anticipated. It's not energy efficient. It's much more convenient to sleep in anabiosis chambers until some 10 hour when the main asteroid wave passes. And when the period of maximum danger has passed, the survivors should have come out of their shelters and started building a new world. In the videos dedicated to space topics over the past 4 years, I have systematically shown the mechanism of this catastrophe in points. That's why we now know that the first and most destructive wave should have hit the planets closest to the Sun, like Earth or Venus, approximately 60 years later, give or take. Then this wave bypassed the Sun, partially absorbing it, partially cutting into it, and went on a second round which took approximately 120 years respectively. The second wave undoubtedly was weaker than the first, but still quite saturated. There was no point in getting out of the bunkers until the second wave had passed. Thus, the minimum duration of civilization's stay in underground cities' refuges should have been from 180 to 240 years. Naturally, all intelligent beings could not fit in there in principle. Many remained on the surface and felt the full power of the catastrophe. A huge number of living creatures perished. Life perished on almost all planets of the solar system that existed at that time. Moreover, entire planets ceased to exist. And now we can only guess how many of them there actually were. In any case, there were at least 2 or 3 between Earth and Jupiter. And Mars was clearly not there at all. Most likely it was torn from another orbit, but I also have a separate film about this which is called Mars Got Lost. In general, judging by everything, the catastrophe that hit the solar system changed and destroyed almost everything. Possibly, Earth remained the only planet where some life and the possibility of further existence were preserved. Nevertheless, the necessary time has passed, and one way or another, but it was time to come out of hiding and restore the destroyed civilizations, but in theory it's not that simple in practice. And here's why. In my very first videos, the ones about dinosaurs, I tried to convey one simple thing to the viewers. The thing is, the environment dictates the form, in a literal sense. If you're a car, then you're going to look like a car, no matter where you're made. If you're a machine, then you're going to look like a machine, no matter where and who makes you. If you live in water, then you're going to look like a fish. It doesn't matter whether you're a fish, a mammalian dolphin, a shark ichthyosaur, or even just a submarine. Boat. None of this matters. You're going to look exactly like a fish. If you live in the air, you'll look like a bird. And it doesn't matter if you're a cellulose eater, that is, a normal bird, a flying mouse, that is, a mammal, a flying fish, that is, a fish proper, or even an airplane, but you'll still look like a bird. In this way, the environment strongly dictates the external appearance of a creature or device. You can, of course, resist this, but it's very energy consuming and absolutely pointless. Therefore, on each planet, depending on the environment, the external appearance of living beings and accordingly civilizations should differ slightly, simply because the probability of different environments on different planets is very high. And that's a problem, because it's simply impossible to settle all species on one of the planets in such a case. If it were us, we would have nothing left to do but to terraform the entire planet for ourselves. In fact, that's what we think. We dream of terraforming Mars, the Moon, or Venus, but we seem to be the only inhabitants here. What if there were, say, 3 or even 12 other civilizations on our planet that are not like us? This would inevitably lead to a bloody war of all against all until the last creature. War for home. Actually, this is how everyone understands it, one way or another. Are there other ways? Everything depends on the level of technology of the chosen civilization. The first thing that comes to mind is to extend the lifespan of anabiosis, hibernation, for a longer period of time, say for 1,000 or even 10,000 years. Wait until the planets regenerate themselves. However, it's naive to rely on this. Of course, some options might regenerate themselves over time, especially if there's any semblance of a biosphere left. But if life is destroyed, the gas composition of the atmosphere is completely changed, like on Venus, then there's no way without external help. At a minimum, we need robotized complexes that will carry out the necessary measures to restore the planet. And even in this case, it will be a very, very long process. It could take thousands of years. Time is relentless. It leads to decay, to dust and dirt, to anything you like. Any metal, plastic, stone, or other material will eventually break down, rust, no matter how high-tech it was. Parts must be replaced and equipment maintained. Besides, how do you know when you can opt out? Who will decide this? Who will decide when it's time to start the awakening process? Who will prepare the city's equipment and mundane housing for those who have just awakened? Who will prepare the food base at the end of the ends? And then, no matter how you twist it, someone will have to surface and manage the process, and this someone should not be a robot, but a biological being capable of self-sustenance and adequate reaction to changing events. Such a duty, that is, as an option, one can assume a simple alternation of duty of certain representatives of the species. Let's say every 50 to 60 years. In this case, if you need to survive 1,000 years, you will need 100 shifts every 10 years. If you have a couple of 100 shift guards ready to give 10 years of their life for observation, then there is no problem. But what if you need to wait not 1,000 years, but 100,000 or 1,000,000? Of course, I exaggerate, but there are no guarantees and there can't be. Besides, the duty crew must have something to eat all the time of their duty. And after it, the next crew and the next, and so on for hundreds of years. Where to get the food? Therefore, and also because living conditions are unique everywhere, it's best to create your own double, but in a different body, more suitable for a given planet. That is, technically speaking, to make a biobot. An entity programmed to protect you and your place of residence, and at the same time capable of living in new conditions. It's no surprise that through centuries and millennia, vague echoes of something similar reach us. The gods created those similar to themselves. However, this was not yet the man we know. These were not yet us simply because the Earth's atmosphere was most likely much denser. It was simply larger, much larger. How much exactly is hard to judge, but the minimum estimate is 4 times more than it is now. The upper limit is unknown. For example, in Venus, the second planet in our solar system, which is most similar to Earth but still weighs 20% less, comfortably holds as much as 92 Earth atmospheres. And this means that for Earth, a mass of 100 atmospheres is not fantasy. It could quite possibly hold it. And a high density of the atmosphere, that is, the environment, dictates large sizes of living organisms. However, it's worth remembering that serious changes occur in the surrounding world when the density of the atmosphere changes. For example, under a pressure of 4 atmospheres, chlorine ceases to be a gas and becomes a liquid. Possibly chlorine lakes would form, and at a pressure of 72.5 atmospheres, at a temperature of about 30 degrees Celsius, carbon dioxide becomes a supercritical fluid. However high the atmospheric density might be, it reduces the load on the skeleton and allows living creatures to reach much larger sizes. And we see this beautifully in the example of prehistoric creatures. Those same dinosaurs, gigantic sloths, titanic pterodactyls, and everything else, no less gigantic and sometimes even saber-toothed. So, the first humanoid, created for life on Earth, must have been gigantic. Indeed, there are no contradictions here either. The ancient Sumerian myths and bas-reliefs directly speak of people 5, even 10 meters tall, and even later pictures, engravings of ruinists, all the architecture of antiquity speaks about us, about the fact that they were intended for a man of much larger size than we are now. And the same myths and legends, each in their own way, speak of demigods, titans, geniuses, jinn, angels, and so on. They were all giants. They all, one way or another, possessed astounding technologies, not only in stone processing, but also in genetic engineering, piloting, and even spacecraft, and so on. The Earth was originally divided among them into sectors. This is even directly mentioned somewhere, for example in the dialogues of Timaeus and Critias, the very ones from which we know about Atlantis, and somewhere this can be seen from their actions. They stayed within the defined boundaries. of their habitat. And despite all the advanced technologies, the technological power, the advanced longevity, they did not populate the entire planet. Some people think they were infertile or germaphobes, but I think these are excuses for the poor. A being, even if initially infertile, possessing fantastic technologies and resources for genetic engineering, can populate as many of its clones as it wants. Yes, in the end, even just to correct their own genetic code. And hermaphrodites don't even need a pair for reproduction. And although there is evidence that they did have unique offspring, they were nonetheless few in number. Apparently, children only appeared out of necessity. And were they even children at all? Look, every god and his son or daughter were responsible for something. For fertility, for success, for strength, for harvest, for sunrise or sunset, and so on. It looks very much like just a service staff command. By itself, any team has a hierarchy of subordination, which from the side can quite seem like a relationship of fathers and children. We can discuss this topic for a very long time, but we don't have any real evidence except for some fragmentary chronicles and oral myths. Therefore, we will not breed unnecessary entities so as not to anger the brevity of Akam. And let's stop at that. So, after 200 or 300 years after the catastrophe, the first demigods, possibly under the control or even in contact with the gods themselves, should have come out of hiding and examined the results. Find out who survived and who didn't. What is the state of the solar system in general? Has the black hole gone, or have we occupied an orbit around it? If yes, which one? If it's gone, where to? Which planets have remained? Which have been destroyed? Which can still be saved? All this needs to be analyzed and a plan for further actions developed. Establish communication with survivors from other planets, with space bases, with those who have gone into free float in lifeboats. There's a lot of work to do. And at this moment it is understood that the cycle of disasters is not yet over. 2 rounds for the flow of asteroids turned out to be very few. He is quite capable of causing a lot of new troubles. And the chaos caused by his bombardment of other planets is still not calming down and not stabilizing. The gods are going back to sleep and maybe they never woke up at all. And the demigods are fulfilling their duties to the improvement of the surrounding territories. At some point, they follow in the footsteps of their creators and also create their own counterparts, but in miniature, about 1.5 to 2 meters tall. Us. What exactly they were guided by at this point is hard to say. Someone was satisfied enough that people were convenient for performing everyday needs. For example, gathering tribute so as not to distract the Titans from their direct duties. But I am inclined to think that this is not the main task. This is one of the goals that was originally set by the gods. Maybe even before they created the Titans. But about this task, about the meaning of life, I will tell in another movie. Now let's focus on our primary goal, and it is to reproduce and multiply, increase the population, but at the same time not to go beyond the boundaries of our sector, and not to forget to bring sacrifices to the gods, that is, simply to provide them with food. They, in turn, created a huge number of the most beautiful temples for people all over the planet. Moreover, in each of them, it screamed from the walls through bas-reliefs, statues, pictures, reproduce, multiply, love each other, gather the harvest, raise cattle, give your fruits to each other and the gods. Service personnel for higher service personnel. I know that apparently at that moment Venus had not yet turned into a fiery hell. The moon was just beginning to form, if it existed at all, and Mars was quite possibly still habitable. On Earth, the atmosphere was still dense enough to allow Titans to exist and directly control humanity. We had to prepare for a new wave of catastrophes. In the chain reaction video, I roughly showed how the catastrophe mechanism worked. The first stream of asteroids came from the very edge of the solar system, from the Kuiper belt. It managed to accelerate quite a lot, but the asteroids were also quite large. It turned out that Earth was in a unique position that allowed it to pass through it relatively calmly, which cannot be said about the other planets. But after performing several maneuvers around the Sun, experiencing the explosive forces of passing perihelion, from the effects of the gravitational forces of Venus, Mercury, Earth, as well as Jupiter with Saturn, many asteroids changed their orbits, shattered into smaller parts, and became more susceptible to the gravitational pulls of the planets. This is how, for example, the class of Apollo asteroids was formed, which move in the range between Mercury and Earth. It is these asteroids, due to the peculiarities of their orbits, that pose the greatest threat to Earth to this day. Some of them even became temporary satellites with unstable orbits. Sooner or later they were torn apart by tidal forces, and they began to fall on the surface of the planets as clay and sandy dust, as well as large metallic pieces themselves. Some researchers suggest that one of the asteroids, passing at high speed through the Earth's atmosphere without touching the surface, could have sucked up part of the atmosphere into space, thereby sharply reducing the atmospheric pressure on Earth. However, in my view, this is improbable. Firstly, because no matter how large the asteroid was, and we have already calculated in previous videos that their sizes were measured in tens and hundreds of kilometers in diameter, but even in this case it was nothing compared to the planet as a whole and the atmosphere in particular. Secondly, the area of its contact with the atmosphere was also insignificantly small, and the passage time was very short. Otherwise it would not have been able to fly further into space and would have rolled around the entire Earth, turning it into hell. By the way, it happened on Venus. The reduction in atmospheric density was caused rather by the fall of stony meteorites which, burning in the atmosphere at a temperature of more than 500 degrees, took a significant part of the oxygen, thus forming ordinary sand. If in addition to silicon, the asteroid also contained aluminum, then passing through the atmosphere, both of these components took in even more oxygen and hydrogen, thus forming ordinary clay. Here is its formula, by the way. In other words, a huge amount of the atmosphere simply went into the composition of sand and clay when cosmic dust burned up. And from this new danger, it was urgently necessary to build additional fortifications. Additional fortifications of the Star Castle on the mountains, and inside the mountains, this catastrophe was no less horrifying than the first fiery one. Sand and clay fell to the earth in a landslide of rain and hail. People wherever they could, and the overwhelming majority perished. Some were found buried under the rubble deep underground. There in the darkness they slowly perished. The evidence is more than sufficient. Huge underground tombs all over Europe, in France, in Italy. The page has very well depicted this topic in the smallest details in its films from the series of tombs in Scipio. Almost certainly this sandy clay rush coincided with the fall of 3 large asteroid fragments at once. One hit the southern part of the Earth, forming the Drake Passage and freezing Antarctica, the second in the equatorial part in the region of Mesoamerica, and the third in the northern part, destroying the Arctic and freezing the Urals and Yakutia. Huge masses of clay and sand, partially washed into the oceans and seas, raised the level of the world ocean, flooding some coastal cities and changing the landscape. I have already described all this in the cycle of videos The Unnoticed Apocalypse. By the way, an interesting nuance. Despite the fact that I don't believe in an asteroid's atmospheric explosion, its fall and simultaneous magnetic and deep freeze of the surroundings clearly have some connection. To find this out, we need to discard the usual knowledge about chemistry that we have now and apply it from the position of increased atmospheric pressure. It's quite possible that at some small height above the Earth, some gases were in a state of supercritical fluid, similar to Venus. And in these states, the process of clay formation went with active absorption of energy from the surrounding environment, which led to a sudden freeze. For example, to form clay, it is necessary to combine the uncombined aluminum oxide with silicon oxide, that is sand, and all this is fixed with water. That is to get the basis of clay kaolin for the tautology. But if you just crush a mountain rock, that is basalt or granite, you won't get any clay no matter how much you crush and blow. Firstly, when you crush basalt, you get maximum abrasive sand, because very special conditions are needed to combine aluminum oxide, silicon oxide and water into a single kaolin molecule. In the natural environment, this is simply impossible. So geologists assume a very long process of acid hydrolysis in an environment of carbonic acid emitted by plant roots. But firstly, this is a very long process, and as we know, many buildings, cities, the entire planet were quickly covered with clay. So quickly that people didn't have time to clear the debris and entire floors ended up buried under it. Secondly, as we know again, plants form humus, among which, if any clay is formed, it is microscopically small, compared to the powerful fertile layer of humus. That is, it turns out that there should be much more humus on the earth than clay, but in reality, it is exactly the opposite. The layer of humus rarely exceeds half a meter, and in some places on earth, it doesn't exist at all. But there are places where clay is tens and even hundreds of meters deep. Plus, let's not forget that for clay, you need to get aluminum somewhere in large quantities. However, geologists have most likely determined the correct principle of colinite formation. They only made a mistake with the source and the speed of the process. Look, first of all, to increase the speed of the reaction, a high pressure is needed, preferably 21 atmospheres or more. Secondly, a large amount of oxygen is needed to oxidize the components, of which there are many. Thirdly, a large amount of hydrogen, and most importantly, a catalyst for the process. And we have all of that in abundance. Silicon and aluminum fall into the composition of the asteroid from space. The high speed of the fall ensures a temperature above 500 degrees and, consequently, the rapid combustion of silicon and aluminum. Thus, the first two components are obtained, aluminum oxide and sand, that is, silicon oxide. Water vapors are already present in the atmosphere. There is no need to look for them. Slowing down in the upper layers of the atmosphere and forming the necessary oxides, sand and dust fall into the lower layers where, due to increased pressure, zones with supercritical water or even carbon dioxide could form. Both are excellent catalysts for the process of kaolin molecule formation. But most importantly, if the bonding process was endothermic, it means a sharp, almost instantaneous drop in temperature to extreme values and precisely over a large area. This is probably how the eternal frost appeared. 3 years without summer, an ice age, and other echoes of what we call a global cooling. But the atmospheric pressure dropped much later, when the process of sand and clay formation had consumed a lion's share of oxygen and hydrogen from the atmosphere. By the way, maybe that's why there is such a miraculous shift towards nitrogen in our atmosphere. It's simply inert and entered the compound much less than oxygen and hydrogen. That's why there's so much more of it left. In fact, this process is to a much lesser extent, but most likely continues to this day. Remnants of crop circles continue to slowly settle on the earth, but due to the reduced pressure compared to the past, clay no longer forms. However, sand continues to form freely, which unusually settles a lot this year in both Europe and Asia and in the Far East. Yes, practically all of it is now again being covered by dust storms as if they came from the Sahara or Mongolia. And we return again to our titans. Either way, the pressure level in the atmosphere has dropped. Moreover, knowing the amount of sand and clay formed by the fallout of cosmic dust, one can imagine the enormous amount of oxygen that has disappeared from it. Titans simply could not live on Earth. Due to a lack of oxygen, they developed hypoxia, which in turn led to depression, brain function impairment, memory loss, chronic fatigue, and ultimately death. This is what we see in later myths, where the Titans are portrayed as quite foolish and inferior creatures. Thus, a large part of them inevitably perished. But some definitely managed to hide in the newly created shelters. And this time they are definitely underground, where it's much easier to create an atmosphere with increased pressure. At a depth of 100 meters, it's quite possible to create a shelter with a pressure of 5, 10 or even 20 atmospheres, which will be self-sustaining due to the pressure of the surrounding rock. The deeper we dig, the higher the pressure we can create in the bunker. But as we know, sand and clay weren't the only things that came. At the same time, several asteroids fell in different parts of the planet. In and of themselves, these falls severely damaged and perhaps even destroyed some of the underground bunkers, enclaves that were on the Earth, and the multi-meter clay plugs could damage the existing exits to the surface. Most likely, the majority of civilization's representatives ended up buried in the depths of the Earth's crust, and the others simply couldn't survive in the more devastated atmosphere. Therefore, it was probably wiser not to surface at all. Nonetheless, some still managed to survive in the new conditions. Ordinary people, but in the overwhelming majority, these were those who stayed on the surface, survived the catastrophe, degraded, forgot about technologies, and only remembered about the gods that they existed. And through the myths, tales, and legends of the fathers, although someone did maintain a connection with the gods, but about this in the second series. The main thing is that some very small groups of people maintained this connection and part of the technology. It was necessary to crawl out again and look around on the spot. Again, to restore civilization. And here, most likely, it turned out that only 1 or 2 conclaves remained active, and both are in Europe. One in the northern part, under the protection of the Scandinavian mountains, the second in the south, in the Mediterranean. In any case, that's how it seemed at the very beginning. But to ascertain this for sure, it was necessary to explore the planet, to see where and what remained. It was necessary to rebuild the cities again, and everything would be fine, if not for one thing: the surviving people, not the few people who hid in the bunkers, but those who somehow survived the catastrophe on the surface. So they lost their connection with the gods and the titans, lost the knowledge about the meaning of life, about nature and purpose. Only one purpose remained: to survive on their own. And so, uniting these people into a single creative force became impossible. Nevertheless, it is somehow still necessary to do this. Because we need to build a civilization, and without uniting many people together, it's impossible to build even a house, let alone a city, a ship, or a fleet. It's already impossible to send a research team where it's needed. It's already impossible to demand unquestioning obedience from people. They have already become independent and simultaneously wild. Of course, the first thing that comes to mind is the creation of religions as a way to control large masses of people. And this is quite an obvious step, but even religion, no matter how remarkable it was, still has a limited duration of action and a limited scope of influence. Something else was needed. Some kind of glue binding people until the moment they finally grow up and create a real civilization. And this glue became money. At the same time, glue and the strongest narcotic, a terrible but necessary invention at that moment, which simultaneously bonded people together and drained them from within. A temporary measure, a very dangerous measure. This is approximately where the story begins. Our story with you. Yes, it looks like a wild fantasy, and almost certainly everything was not like that or not quite like that. But is there a way to find out what really happened without resorting to such fantasies? Perhaps there is, we just haven't found it yet. What about official historians? Well, how do the fantasies of official historians differ from this one? What kind of questions does official history give a clear, indisputable, logical answer to? One way or another, but the continuation follows.